Welcome to part 2 of the Advanced Concepts in Choice-Based Conjoint webinar, hosted by your friends at Sawtooth Software. My name is Megan Pites, and my colleague Erin Hill and I will be leading you through this webinar, covering topics including partial profile, shelf sets, and free format CBC. Part 1 was jam-packed with information, so let's get started on part 2.
Thanks, Megan. I'm excited to be here with you guys today, and I hope that you find some value in the presentation we have for you. I know a lot of you are experienced users that have been around the block a couple times, and so many of you, this may not be new material, but a lot of times it's good to review things that we've known before, or be reminded of some of the new research that's come out that may change how we think about some of these methods. So we're going to start out today talking about partial profile designs in CBC. Then we're going to talk a little bit about shelf sets and how you would put together a shelf display type conjoint. And then we'll talk about free format CBC. And all three of these methods, they're more advanced things than we normally do with CBC studies. But I think that most researchers, if you do conjoint to any degree in your career, they're very good things to have in your toolbox. Even things like partial profile, we've written off a lot of in the past couple of years because of advances like adaptive CBC. But I think it's good to go back and be reminded of why they do still work and which situations they work well in. So we're going to start out with partial profile CBC. Now, partial profile CBC, traditionally, with CBC designs, we define our attributes and levels, and we show all of the respondents all of the attributes every time. So when we go to show a product concept and we have 15 attributes, we're going to show them 15 pieces of information that describe that particular product concept. Well, with partial profile designs, rather than showing all the attributes at the same time, we randomly select a subset of the attributes that we show in each task. So task 1 might show attributes A, C, E, D, and F, and task 2 might show attributes A, B, F, G, and H. So attributes are rotated through, so each task contains a different subset, but that over the course of the interview, all the attributes are typically seen at least once, and usually many times, so that we have full coverage of all of our attributes and levels. So let's take, for example, a questionnaire where we're looking at MRI systems. Now, MRI systems have a lot of different attributes that might be very relevant for doctors, but it's a difficult thing for them to consider. So there's a lot of very important things like which brand you're purchasing from. They may have different support characteristics. They may have different salespeople. So brand's going to be important. How the patient has to be positioned in the MRI equipment might be important. What types of tests you can do, how much space it requires. Am I going to totally have to change my office configuration to use this piece of equipment? So all of these things are very significant to a healthcare provider that would want to install an MRI system. But because this is a lot of information, we may not want to present it all at the same time. So we could potentially do this as a partial profile. So we could break this up and show just a partial list of each of the attributes and levels. So in the first question, I might ask about brand and patient position and field strength, how much magnetic resonance am I sending through them, and whether it supports specifically neurovascular type tests or cardiac tests or spine tests, and how much it costs. And then in the second question, I might show them about clinical space requirements and whether there's a brain array, a cardiac array. So some of these things are going to be repeated in the next question. Other attributes are going to be new. And then we've got a couple of them, the brand and patient position and system cost, that are going to be there every time. So we're going to rotate some of them. We're going to leave some of them fixed. So in this case, maybe we believe that you can't make a decision if you don't know the cost and the brand, and you don't know whether it would actually work for your particular situation. So you need to know how the patient is going to be positioned in the machine. So we can do partial profile. We can have the software rotate our attributes in. And there's a lot of benefits to allowing us to rotate these attributes in. So if we allow us to rotate attributes in, then it seems like there's really no limit to the number of attributes we can include in our study. You know, for a number of years, back when I first started at Sawtooth, we would say, you know, you probably don't want to include more than about 6 or 7 attributes in your conjoint, because that, you know, more than that, and people can't really focus on them and respond adequately to more attributes. They just can't keep more than about 7 in their brain at the same time and make consistent judgments on them. So if we can do partial profile, then we can keep under this kind of arbitrary 6 or 7 attribute limit, which, you know, turns out over the years that that doesn't necessarily actually exist, but still we kind of like to keep the amount of information as low as possible. So we can include 30, 40 attributes in our study, and it reduces the respondent burden. They're not having to look at all 30 or 40 every single time. It also forces our respondents to consider all the attributes. So, you know, if we're only showing 2 attributes at a time, then they're required to look at both of them, even if they wouldn't have looked at those 2 attributes in a bigger 40 attribute set, right? So benefits, again, we reduce the respondent burden, we can include more attributes in our study, and we get better attentiveness from the respondents because we're only showing them a subset, so they pay more attention to the attributes that may be lower on their priority list. There's a couple problems with partial profile designs, though. Typically, it requires larger sample size, or you've got to ask more tasks per respondent. Because we're rotating the attributes in, they're not going to be seen every time. So if you could normally do a CBC study with 10 choice tasks, now you used to be able to do that with a 7 or 8 attribute study, and now you've got 20 attributes. Well, now we're rotating the attributes in, and so you need to ask more questions before we can even cover all of the attributes. Data are often quite noisy at the individual level for very large designs, and this is part of a problem where, you know, typically we don't want to ask each respondent a huge number of questions, and so we make up for it by asking larger number of respondents. So when we're rotating the attributes in less often, we have less information, and therefore when we go to estimate their utilities, it's a little bit noisier. We also tend to find that we get flattening of attribute importances. There just isn't enough questions to be able to, you know, say for instance price. If we're rotating price it, you know, typically if somebody was a very price conscious person, you know, maybe that's what they make 80% of their decisions based on. You know, if price is only showing up in 1 out of every 3 tasks, then 2 of every 3 tasks, they're having to answer it on this 20% of the information that they don't normally look at. And so price's importance is going to be flattened a little bit relative to the other attributes because we're forcing more attention on the other attributes and we're allowing them to give less attention to price. So related to that, we tend to see an understatement of the importance of price. Now some of this can be alleviated, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The other thing that we worry about with partial profile designs is that we assume when we give people these tasks that they are maintaining an all else equal mindset. So if an attribute doesn't show up, we're assuming that that level is the same for all of the products that we're showing them. But it may not be the case. So, you know, if you take these MRI systems here, and you know, let's say you are you're a neurosurgeon, so you're concerned about whether it can look at a brain array and a neurovascular array and a spine array, right? So there's different things that we can look at. You don't care whether it has a lower leg array because that's not part of your you know, what you do. You don't care much about the neurovascular array because you're not a heart surgeon. So if you're a neurosurgeon, you care about the brain, you care about neurovascular, and you care about spine. And so in both of these tasks, we're missing some of the pieces that are critically important to you to make a decision. So, you know, in the one up front here, we've got neurovascular and spine arrays, but we don't have the brain array. And in the second one, we've got the brain array, but we don't have the neurovascular or the spine array. So if you're a person that runs a neurovascular or a neurosurgery clinic, how do you answer those questions if those pieces of information are missing? We also see issues where, you know, people will see large price differences, and they tend in our minds to want to justify those price differences. So, you know, if this phone arm machine is $2 million and the GE machine is $3 million, and I know that GE machines tend to come bundled with a bunch of other stuff, I might assume that GE's normal bundle comes with this $3 million machine and Fonar's doesn't. And I may be wrong, because those may be other attributes that we've included elsewhere in our model specifically, and I'm assuming that it comes with more features than it actually does. So I may pick the $3 million machine making assumptions about it that aren't true in our experimental design. So holding all else equal is an issue with respondents. If you're doing partial profile designs, we strongly encourage you to use wording that reminds them that if an attribute is missing, they should assume that it's equal across all products. So, you know, in this case, I would, you know, as a doctor, I might assume in the first task, oh, well, I'm going to assume that all three of them have brain arrays because it's just not listed there. Okay, so to set up a partial profile design in Lighthouse Studio, we would set up our attributes and levels the same way we normally would. We put in our number of random tasks and our fixed tasks and concepts per task. And then down in the lower right-hand corner under the Advanced Design Module settings, we would tell it that we wanted to put in a partial profile CBC design. We'd tell it how many attributes we want to show, and then we'd tell it which attributes we wanted to rotate in. So in the case of this example here of the MRI systems, you know, we're showing 7 attributes per task. And you know, maybe I had 20 in this survey. So we've got the first and the second ones that we always want to show up. So brand and patient position, we always want to show up. And system cost down at the bottom, we always want that to show up. So those would be attributes 1, 2, and 20 if I had a 20 attribute study. So in these partial profile CBC design settings, I would have set this to say I want to show 7 attributes at a time, and I want to rotate attributes 3, so we want 1 and 2 to stay the same, so I want to start rotating at attribute 3, and I want to rotate through attribute 20 or 19, leaving attribute 20 out of the rotated block. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So you specify the first attribute and the last attribute that you want included in the rotated block. So anything you want to show up in each task, you want to have at the top of your list or the bottom of your attribute list. Okay. All right, and then you can do all of the other things. You can do attribute randomization and concept sorting and things. You do have to be a little bit careful, because if you do attribute randomization, or I'm sorry, concept sorting is going to be a little weird. So if we say, hey, sort by brand, and then we don't include brand, you know, we include in the number of attributes that are rotated, then it wouldn't know what to do. So, you know, because brand's not there, it's not going to sort. Same for attribute randomization. Attribute randomization is going to work just fine, but it gets a little weird when we've got different numbers of attributes showing up. So be a little bit careful with those settings. But other than that, it works just like regular CBC. Respondents are going to see tasks. The design is generated knowing the attribute randomization process that we want to use. And so it's going to generate a fixed design just like we normally get out of CBC with your 300 versions or whatever. And you're good to go. So you can field it. Analysis runs just like with regular CBC. So again, just reviewing what we've talked about. So in partial profile designs, we can have some attributes such as price that are fixed so that they're always present in the task. And often this makes tasks more realistic. You know, we want to make tasks as realistic as possible for the respondents while not overburdening the respondents. So if we can put in attributes that they normally expect to see, then it can make it more realistic for them. They get better data that way. Preliminary research that we've done suggests that it doesn't bias the parameters for the forced inclusions. So, if we have brand in there every time, it doesn't necessarily mean that that attribute is going to be, have artificially higher importance than it normally would. So if we run surveys where we look at partial profile designs versus full profile designs, we tend to see roughly the same types of importance scores for the attributes that were rotated versus the ones that weren't. But there hasn't been a lot of research on this over the years. Seems like we did a lot of research on this back in like 2003, 2004, but not a lot's been done since then. So it would be a good thing for somebody to go back and revisit, maybe at our next conference or something. All right, for design considerations, with partial profile designs, we're rotating attributes through, so it essentially reduces your effective sample size. So if we have 10 attributes, and we're only showing 5 of those attributes at a time, assuming equal numbers of levels and things like that, we're only collecting about 50% as much information as we would have using full profile. So if you think about it, if I have 10 questions and I'm only showing 5 attributes at a time, then each attribute is only showing up in half the task. So we essentially have 5 attributes worth of information for each, and 5 tasks worth of information for each attribute, where normally we would have 10 tasks worth of information for each attribute. So it would stand to reason that if we've got 50% as much information, then we should probably increase our sample sizes to compensate. And so for the first several years I was at Sawtooth, that's what I would tell people. Hey, if we've got, if we're rotating our attributes and they're all showing up half as often, you need to double your sample size. But then a couple years after I started working here, Keith Sean came back and said, hey, Aaron, that's not exactly an accurate answer, because when we show things partial profile, there's less noise from the respondents. So respondents can look at these product concepts and make more rational judgments, more consistently answer these things. And so even though we've got less data, we've got better quality data, and so if you're looking just at standard errors, our standard errors actually stay about the same given the same number of questions. So because respondent level error is decreased, it tends to offset the measurement error by having fewer incidences of showing our attributes. So to some extent you do need to consider it and adjust sample sizes, particularly if you're showing a very small percentage of the attributes each time. If I have 40 attributes and I'm only showing 5 at a time, I'm really going to want to make sure that I've got a large enough sample to accurately estimate utilities for that. But if I've got 10 attributes and I'm showing 8 at a time, I may not need to make much of an adjustment for sample size at all. Okay, all right, a couple other design considerations. You need to think about which attributes you want to rotate through. Some attributes make sense to rotate through, and it doesn't really impact their ability to keep all else equal. You also want to make sure it's realistic to the market. So, for TVs and stuff, if I walk into my local store to look at TVs, each of them already don't advertise in full profile, right? You go up to one TV and it's got a tag on it that shows a certain subset of attributes that its manufacturer wants to talk about. And you look at the next brand of TV and it shows its attributes that it wants to talk about. And very often it's very difficult to make cross product comparisons because they don't have information symmetry across products. So when you're thinking about which attributes to be rotated, you probably want to not rotate the ones that show up every time. So when you walk into the store and you see a certain subset of features, all of them show brand, all of them show the screen size, for instance, all of them show price, you'd probably want to not rotate those in. But then, feature sets and whether it can connect to Netflix or whatever, you probably could rotate in because there's information asymmetry already. You do have to keep in mind that non-rotated attributes will have more information than rotated attributes. So, if brand's showing up every time, you're obviously going to have more information about brand than you do about the other ones. Nice thing about that is that this also allows you to kind of control for information. So if you need really good reading on things like, if the purpose of the survey is to look at price sensitivity, then you can not rotate price, and we make sure that we get lots of good information about price. So we have, it makes it easier for us to estimate those utilities. Whereas if you've got attributes that you're not quite as concerned about, you just kind of need a general directional information, then by all means rotate those ones. Okay. As far as analysis goes, partial profile designs are analyzed the same way you'd analyze a standard CBC. If you look at the old CHO file, or if you look at how we're coding things behind the scenes when you run it through HB or latent class or anything, if an attribute is missing from the design, we just stick a 0 in, so it has no impact on predicting whether they chose an option or didn't choose an option. As far as the simulations go, the nice thing about the way CBC works is that you can simulate scenarios with as many attributes or as few attributes varying as you wish. So even though we collected the data partial profile, you can run simulations where you have all the attributes represented. You can set some of them equal to each other to change the number of attributes that vary, but you're free to run your analysis just like you would have had they been shown full profile. Well, how well does partial profile work? We used to do partial profile all the time. It was a good kind of middle ground between choice-based conjoint and the old ACA software that would allow you to do large numbers of attributes. So for a number of years, the first several years that I was at Sawtooth, we did partial profile designs all the time. Over the past couple of years, we've done some studies looking at how partial profile compares to other methods. And what Keith has found over the years is that partial profile is overall more efficient because even though it has the lower statistical efficiency, we get less respondent fatigue. People don't have to use simplification heuristics. In other words, if I'm confronted with a study where I've got 20 attributes showing up each time, you're showing me 4 concepts per task, and each of the concepts has 20 attributes to it. As a respondent, I'm going to look at that and say, oh, well, I can't keep all those things in my mind at the same time. I have preferences for stuff, but something like price or square footage of a house or something like that, I'm going to have to look at some of those things and say, what, but once I get through the first top 5 attributes, I really can't consider anything else because my decision's already been made for me by that point. And so they use simplification heuristics to say, I'm not even going to look at these attributes because given the large number of attributes I can't make reliable judgments anyway, and usually any benefit from those is already swamped by the other attributes in the study. So the nice thing is if you do partial profile, then we can reduce the need for people to use these simplification heuristics because we reduce it down to a set where they can make consistent judgments across the product concepts. If you look at the models that come out of partial profile and full profile designs, we find that the parameters that we estimate are quite similar. So essentially we end up with a very similar model. The only difference we see is that the scale of the utilities is a little different for partial profile than for full profile. Partial profile designs, because we're showing fewer attributes, there's more noise, but we also are more certain about their answers, and so the scale of the utilities tends to be slightly larger, showing that we're more confident in our model's predictive abilities than we are with full profile, which tends to make sense. If people are using simplification heuristics and they're ignoring attributes, then we're not sure what the impact of feature X is, and so we're going to have lower utilities coming out of it. So once you adjust for scale between them, we end up with virtually the same model. So partial profile and full profile parameters are usually roughly equivalent. There's also some evidence that suggests that partial profile parameters may reflect a flattening of importances relative to full profile. So critical attributes become less important if you look at the ranges. Unimportant attributes become more important. And this is similar to what we see with ACA, where when you're only looking at a subset of the attributes, it tends to inflate the importance of all the attributes. So relatively speaking, the critical ones become less important relatively, and the unimportant ones become more important relatively speaking. And we've seen this in subsequent studies. So it's just something to be aware of. If you've got a huge range in how important you think attributes are, partial profile may give you slightly misleading statistics on importance scores. A couple other things. Do you have questions? Or?
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to jump in really quick. We're talking about how we're only showing a couple different attributes at a time. And we know from typical in CBC, an adaptive choice-based conjoint, we can ask some calibration questions at the end. What is your take on maybe adding in calibration questions into a partial profile that includes all of the attributes as a follow-up question, or in a simpler sense, thinking of like it as a max-diff direct anchoring approach? Any thoughts on that, or have you seen that being done, Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible to include some anchoring questions or calibration questions. We don't directly support it in CBC though. One of the things that's nice about CBC and by extension partial profile CBC is that you can include a none. So in all of these studies, you can include a none like you could with a regular CBC. And so, our kind of, if you look at how we do these things, ACA, we had to include a calibration section because you weren't getting purchase likelihood type things. You didn't know, a standard ACA assumes that they're going to choose a product. We just don't know how that product is rated. Where with CBC, we can include a none to get that information. So it's not included as a part of the software. So it would be something you'd need to do outside of the software and kind of hand code your data. But it is possible to do, and if you're looking for that type of thing, it would probably be recommended. So calibration questions would be fine. What was the question? What was the question about the max if?
Oh no, I was just using that as an example since we have the direct anchoring approach in that as well.
Yeah. Megan, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah. Oh, similar thoughts. I mean, if you have the expert capabilities and the, advanced criteria to be able to incorporate some of those calibration questions, I think that's great. I think you do need to consider the approach, right? Because we're telling our users to use partial profile because having them review a full profile of the product or service is too overwhelming. So expecting them to also know how to judge it, and a follow-up calibration question kind of goes back on saying, oh, well, maybe they could have essentially evaluated the full profile. So I think there are probably some trade-offs and some things to consider, but I always, as a, data person, analytics, more information the better. So if you can incorporate it, awesome. Real quick, one other question before we move along. We've said in the past, actually in our intro to ACBC webinar, that when you have more than 6 to 7 attributes, ACBC is a good approach, right? But when is it better to use partial profile versus adaptive choice-based conjoint?
Yeah, so I think partly that feeds into the next bullet point here. We've done some research with partial profile that shows that because we're showing things partial profile, one of the differences between ACBC and partial profile CBC is that ACBC, we actually are showing things full profile, but we're graying out attributes so that they only have to look at and consider the ones that are changing, right? So we may show 10 attributes on a screen, but only 6 of them change from product to product. And so it's essentially partial profile, but we show them the full profile information. So there's some evidence that there's a price effect in partial profile that's similar to the price effect for ACA, where price tends to get underestimated. And we don't see that in a CBC. There's a lot more price information. We're showing price more often. We're varying price differently. So we end up getting a lot more data on price than we do with an ACA. Compared to ACA, I think I would, I'd prefer probably partial profile if you've got the sample size to do it. ACBC would be, I'd probably go with ACBC, but there's a lot of situations where ACBC doesn't work very well. So anytime you have a large number of attributes that are a priori ordered, ACBC doesn't work very well. For instance, if you have a survey where you're looking at, let's say we're looking at a drug for a certain condition, and you take somebody into an ACBC, maybe we're talking about a cancer patient or something. You take them into an ACBC and you say, hey, let's go through the build your own section. How much nausea do you want? And they say, none. And they say, okay, well, how many rashes and ulcers, skin lesions do you want? None. How much hair do you want to lose? None. And so, the build your own section just doesn't make any sense. And so, the whole ACBC process breaks down because all the attributes are ordered. And at least in the US, we can't put prices on it because the patients don't actually pay the bill. So in those types of situations, partial profile CBC studies work a lot better because, you get the reduced amount of information that they have to consider, but we're still covering all of our attributes. But we're not systematically introducing bias or having them introduce assumptions about things. Partial profile CBC is going to throw together combinations that no respondent would choose to throw together on their own, right? So I would tend to use partial profile CBC in situations where ACBC just wasn't a good tool. Also, it can be used in situations where you've got large sample sizes, but you've got a short interview. One of the problems with the ACBC is that it's a fairly long interview. And so, people can take 15 minutes in an ACBC interview, where with partial profile, assuming you've got a large enough sample size to cover it, maybe you do a partial profile, but only, 10 or 15 questions. And then you make up for the lack of data by just having, large sample. So those are a couple of the situations where I like partial profile CBC better than ACA or ACBC. Partial profile CBC also allows you to do, a lot of the other things, chip allocation models. It allows you to do some of the other goodies that you can't get with ACBC or ACA. You can capture the design on the fly. So if you're wanting to do like menu-based stuff or customize the way that your tasks look, you can do that with partial profile CBC where you can't with ACBC.
Perfect. Thanks, Aaron. Since we're at 35 past, maybe we should jump to shelf sets now.
Sure. Yep. Okay. All right. So, a couple other things here. The nice thing about partial profile is because we reduce the respondent level error, we can see side benefits. Like, for instance, we see fewer reversals for things like price. So if you look at price and you're looking at, people naturally should prefer, all else equal, lower prices to higher prices. And sometimes we see reversals where, because of errors in the way they answer or whatever, people have reversals. And we find that partial profile designs, because they're more focused on a smaller subset of attributes, we find that those reversals happen less often. There were some issues back in the past with the priors being wrong with CBC HP. I think a lot of that has been fixed over the years, so I don't think that's as much of an issue. So anyway, so that's partial profile CBC. And we'll answer other questions. If you have other questions, we'll leave some time for answers to those questions a little bit later. Okay, shelf-facing displays. We want to just touch on this just briefly today. There's some of you out there that may not know that it's around, and we just wanted to make you aware of it and give you a couple pointers on it. So shelf-facing displays, a lot of times we want to do projects where we show things in a more realistic way. We found over the years that the more realistic your questions are, the better data you get. So Sawtooth software allows you to do a shelf-facing display where you can have an image that you'd create that looks kind of like a shelf. So we'd have this you know, rather than having a picture of one bottle of this detergent, you know, we might create a picture with 4 bottles of the detergent because we know that that's typically how much shelf space that particular product has. And so maybe this, you know, particular variety only gets a 1 spot shelf allotment, where this one gets 4, this one gets 8, because they can be double stacked. And so we can set these things up to allow us to measure, you know, the brand, but also, you know, maybe we have an attribute that says, well, how much shelf space do you get? Do you get 2 bottles or 3 bottles or 4 bottles? And so you can see the impact of having 2 bottles or 3 bottles or 4 bottles on the shelf. And it looks more realistic to the respondent. The way you set this up is you would go into an SSI web task, and on the Format tab, down at the bottom lower left, there's a display type, and you can do a normal display type, or you can do a shelf-facing display. And the shelf-facing display, all it does is say, well, how many rows do you want in each task? So how many shelves do you want vertically? And then you can tell it how many concepts on each row. So in this case, we've ordered these things so that the order of the products isn't going to vary, because we want the you know, powdered detergent in big boxes to be at the bottom. We want the liquids to be at the top. You know, you could vary things if you wanted to, but most of the time we know that we want particular brands together. So you want all the Ariel ones over here on the left, and the Persil brand ones, you know, in this next thing, so that they're grouped like people would actually see them in the grocery store. And so, you know, for this top row, we've gone and we've said, okay, well, we know that Ariel is going to show up here and Persil is going to show up here. We've got 2 different versions of Persil. So we want 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 products to show up on this first row. But because we've got some bigger boxes down here, we only want 6 of them to show up on this row, and 7 of them on this row, and 7 of them on this row. So you can tell it how many products to have on the shelves. And then, so for each row, we'll tell it how many concepts to show on the rows. You tell it where to put the none option. So you can have it the last concept in the task. So we could have had it, you know, over here next to Mr. Proper. Or we can say, we'll show it down at the bottom of the page, and so it shows up down here at these, none of these. And that's it. So as far as setting it up goes, that's all you need to do. But then the trick to doing these is that we would create a graphic for each of these products. And so if you went to the Attributes tab, you're going to be able to go in and set up conditional displays where you say, hey, if we're showing Ariel brand and it's a 17-ounce bottle, we want to show this picture. If it's a 22-ounce bottle, we want to show a different picture. And so you can tell it which picture to show here. And these pictures would have been created so they showed the bottles here, but also the background color, and then it looks like there's a little bit of a shelf here that they photoshopped in to make it look like a shelf. And we're just going to take this graphic here and plot it next to this graphic here, next to this graphic here. So the software won't do the graphic creation for you, but allows you to control the layout of the graphics so that it looks more like a shelf. A couple other options you'll want to set. You'll want to go in and set the background color for the shelf. You're going to tell it what the border looks like, so you're going to tell it how thick you want that shelf to be. So if we look back here, there's a border here. Whoops. There's a border here underneath the products, the software will put in, and there's a border down at the bottom. And then all of the other attributes would go in this space here. So, right now we're just showing price here, but we could have had something that says, we could add a little red button that said on sale, or, we could make this stuff dynamic. It could show the, the brand and the size of the bottle. You could say a cost per ounce, for instance. And so you could make it look a lot more like a standard shelf. Okay. The advantage to using shelf-facing displays, again, it does take a lot more work, but we find that the more realistic we can make these things, the better the data is. The more they can put themselves in the mindset that they are actually in when they go shopping. So we just kind of wanted to introduce it and show you what shelf-facing displays was, and let you know that it was an option. Okay, anything else you want to add there, Megan?
No, I don't think so. I was trying to think of, amongst the consulting projects that you and I do, what proportion end up being shelf sets. It's probably pretty niche in comparison to maybe to a partial profile, or even free format, which we'll talk about next. But it is a capability, and it's great when the instance arises.
Yeah. Okay. Any other audience questions?
Okay. Not yet.
All right. Okay. So next thing we want to talk about, and last topic of the day, is free format questions. Now, it seems like when we introduced free format CBC questions, it seemed like we used them very irregularly. Most people were still doing CBC in standard ways, and we were trying to fit the problem into the solution rather than expanding the solution to fit the problem. And so a lot of CBC studies, Peter Kurtz and you guys will remember, taking a project and trying to figure out ways to reduce the conjoint so it fit in the software rather than allowing the software to fit the conjoint. But there's a lot of times, and it seems like more and more this comes up, where we want to ask CBC questions differently than the software naturally wants to ask them. So standard CBC layout is great if people are just making one choice, right? So we can ask a question like this, where we've got hotel examples, and 20 years ago this worked just fine because maybe this is kind of like what you get from your travel agent, right? You see a hotel type and the number of nights for your trip, and whether it got good customer reviews or whatever, and the pricing for it. And so people would look at this, and it's as realistic as anything else they might have seen out there. But more and more, our clients are asking us to do things like this, where they say, hey, Aaron, when you were talking about the shelf-facing display where you said that we want things to be realistic, well, this is reality for hotels. We show pictures over to the side. We show the ratings up there. We've got, different colors and different layouts and stuff. And so when people go to a kayak or something like that, hotels.com, this is what they're going to see. They're going to see something more like this. So this is totally unrealistic now. This is more like what they actually see. So we want our conjoints to look more like this. So how do you do that? There's a couple other situations where we want to change things. So maybe we want to do a chip allocation where we say, hey, tell us how many packs of soft drinks are you going to buy? And we want them to put in a chip allocation rather than something else. But maybe we also want to ask them, well, which one of those is your favorite? Or very often what people want to do is for pharmaceutical type studies, we're going to say, hey, here's a bunch of drugs you could give your patient. Consider different patient types. So what would you prescribe if your patient was a diabetic? What if they didn't have diabetes? And so we want multiple responses, but we want to use the same design to ask the question. Maybe we want to do alternative input methods, consideration set. We want to say which of these would you consider now, which one would you choose? So any of those types of things, and especially now that we've got like menu-based choice and stuff, there's a lot of reasons why the standard CBC layout just doesn't work for what we need. And then even further than that, we've got alternative specific designs where labeling doesn't work very well sometimes. You may want to show multiple fixed products where you want to show levels of fixed attributes that just don't vary, and so there's not a good way to put it into the CBC. And just anytime you don't like the way we make things look. So what we've done is we've put in some scripting language stuff that allows you to generate a design using the standard CBC, but then collect the data using a different tool. So I mean, not a different tool, but a different layout. So we can go into what we call a free format question, and we can put in some HTML to allow us to customize how we lay out the question. So for free format questions, the question parameters look a lot similar to what you see in the other question types, where you got the header 1, header 2, footer. Where things start to get a little different is that it allows you to define your own variables. So we can add whatever types of variables we want. We can add radio buttons that collect data just like a regular CBC does. We can add multiple radio buttons, so we can collect first choice, second choice, third choice. We can collect best and worst, or patient 1, patient 2. We can get chip allocation. We can say, hey, how many would you buy of these for a quiet night at home with your wife? How many would you buy for a party with your friends? We can ask all sorts of different questions based on the same CBC design. So it allows us to tap into the CBC design, but then ask questions differently. So in this case, we're adding a radio button. We can also add checkboxes or select or text buttons or whatever we want. We can say, hey, pick which one you like, and then we can have a box underneath that says, what did you like about that product? What didn't you like about that product? So CBC Web, or Lighthouse Studio, includes the ability to display the attribute text, the level text for the CBC design. You can recall the numbers of the attributes and levels. So if you're writing some custom script, you can grab a lot of data that way. And it allows you to store the CBC answers back into the right spots in the data file, so you can run your analysis like you normally would. So the steps to doing a CBC free format, you actually start out creating a CBC design. So if I had called my CBC study CBC, then maybe I would, it's going to come up with CBC ran 1, CBC ran 2, CBC ran 3, etc. And so I'm going to create a free format one and maybe call it something like FF task. So I'd create one called FF task ran 1 that corresponds with CBC ran 1, FF task random 2 that corresponds with CBC random 2, etc. And you want to place each free format question on the same page as the corresponding CBC question. And then I'm going to go into this free format question layout, and I'm going to go down into the lower box there with the HTML, and I'm going to start putting in the HTML to create the layout that I want for my CBC task. So typically, we're going to start with a table, because that's the way regular CBC tasks are laid out. So a table allows you to set up multiple rows and columns. Table row would create, like this income status here. This is one row. Table data is the information in one cell. So we're going to create a table, and we use table rows and table data to create the layout of that table. And then within each cell, we need to populate it with some sort of data. So in order to produce the income status here, maybe I've rotated my attributes, so maybe I can't just type in income status. I can go in and I can either fixed label it, and I can say TD for table data, and I can just type in income status, and that would just show up next in this position on this table. Or I can actually go in and I can use an SSI script to put in the attribute text here. And the same is true for levels. So I can go in and I can say, hey, we need to dynamically insert this. So we're going to go use an SSI script function. So for my, in my table, I'm going to have a table tag and then a TD tag. And within the TD tag, I'm going to say, I want to use a script. So this bracket percent says, hey, I'm going to use a script here. And the script function is called CBC Design Level Text. And it's kind of like an Excel function where it would be equals, the function name, and then in parentheses, the arguments for that function. So similar thing here. So here's our function name. We want a CBC Design level text. And then parentheses, here's the arguments. The argument is the CBC question name. So if this was my first CBC random question, it would say CBC ran 1. And then the concept position number, this is which one of these concepts are we talking about? Are we talking about the first one, the second one, the third one? And then the level text position number, which attribute are we talking about? So in this case, to pull up the text that was associated with first concept, third attribute, we would type in CBC Design level text, CBC ran 1 if this was our first CBC task, comma 1, so first concept, third attribute, show whatever text we need to show here. Okay. All right, so in doing this, you can capture the information and display it on the screen. You can also capture it and save it to other variables for use later. Occasionally we have somebody that does some much more complex stuff, and we'll need to actually like save the design in the background so we can do further analysis on it. So you can use this to save what the design was that was shown to the respondent. You know, if I want to ask a follow-up question about the concept that they chose, I can save out the design information and then populate the next question and say, hey, it looks like you chose the 4 full head of hair large family option. Why did you like that? Or, you know, what's the chance that you'd go purchase this at Toys R Us? All right, now to add the response option, we're going to go in and we're going to use SSI script to automatically put in this radio button for us. And so in our table data cell, we're going to declare a class. This is using a little bit of CSS, and we're going to say, hey, this thing that we're adding here is a clickable input cell. So if they click anywhere in this box, we want to record it as clicking that radio button. And then we're going to put in a script here that says, Sawtooth software, go make my radio button, and call it free format task random 1 response, and we're going to record it as option whatever concept we're talking about. So if we've like sorted things or rotated things or whatever, you know, maybe it's actually in the design files the 4th option, and we're going to save it as the 4th option even though it occurred in the first position. So it allows you to do all sorts of dynamic stuff and automatically have it kind of handle stuff for you. We do have to put the script in. So it looks complex, but it actually isn't all that bad. So if I'm creating a free format CBC question, the first thing I do is add in my CBC task, and then I push F1 to look for the help on how to do these free format tasks. And then I'll preview the CBC task and look at what the HTML is already for the regular CBC task. And then I'll just copy and paste. I'll steal the code from the regular CBC task and paste it into my free format question, and then just modify it to make it work with the free format stuff. A strong warning, please be careful about checking your HTML syntax for each of these custom CBC questions to make sure that you're showing things right. If you make a mistake and you are referring to the 4th CBC task when you're actually collecting data for the 5th CBC task, for instance, it's going to throw everything off, and our design's going to think it was the 4th one, but you know, the 5th one, but you actually showed the 4th one, and so it can make your designs very imbalanced, and it can lead to significant problems when you're running your analysis. So please test your studies. We don't get rid of the CBC tasks until you tell us to. So I often, you know, every time I do this, I'll run through a test where I have the regular CBC task on the same page as the one that I've constructed, and I'll go through and check detail by detail to make sure that everything lines up exactly right, and I'll even, you know, view the source code to make sure that they're being recorded as the same option numbers and things. So please make sure you test these things thoroughly, and then go back and look at the data set to make sure that it recorded your answer at all, and also the way that you wanted it recorded. A couple things that will help you. So there's some cascading style sheets that will help you. So, you know, for select questions, there's a question type where you can declare a different type of question, and then there's more things you can do that we already built in. So once you've declared a type of thing for a question, you can automatically do a lot of other things with it. There's a lot of help on cascading style sheets and also JavaScript functions in the help for the program. So I strongly recommend as you're going through this that you push the F1 button and look at the help. We provide a lot of things that should be very helpful for you. There's also a lot of online resources. So if you go up to like W3 School or HTML Goodies, there's great information about just starting learning about HTML and CSS and JavaScript. You could preview any of our questions and then right-click and view source to see how we've put things together. And a lot of what we do, you can just copy and paste in, and it saves you a lot of time. There's also a text editor, so as you're adding questions and you're putting in these hooks and the table elements and things like that, that will help you add HTML tags correctly. So as you're typing things in, it will start formatting correct HTML tags for you. Also, don't forget that you can always go down and buy a book. So get on Amazon, pick up a book. You can go to your library. There's tons of books. Virtually any HTML book or CSS book will be relevant to what you're doing in SSI Web. And if you get really, really desperate, you can call up your local high school or college and ask them for help. A lot of high school kids now can do way more online stuff than I can, so they can sometimes be a great resource. Hopefully that was helpful, at least introducing you to some of the more advanced things you can do with CBC. We'll stick around here for questions, and please feel free to keep in touch. We really appreciate your time here today, appreciate your attendance with us, and thank you so much for supporting Sawtooth Software. I looked over the attendee list, and I've known many of you for years and years, and we really appreciate your being our customers, but also more than that, just being our friends. So thank you very much. Have a great day. Megan, back to you.
Thanks, Aaron. I'll just jump in and mention two things. Aaron was talking about learning HTML and so on and so forth. At the Sawtooth Software Conference coming up, we have an all-day workshop on Tuesday with Justin and David from our team going over Advanced Lighthouse Studio workshop, covering HTML, CSS, JavaScript, etc. So that would be really cool to attend. I'll also mention that some of the things we've showed you over the past 2 weeks are only available in our CBC Advanced Design module, specifically alternative specific designs, partial profile, and shelf display. So if you are interested in executing any of those, you'll need the CBC Advanced Design module for that. I think other than that, one last question, Aaron, obviously about sample sizes. Can you address if there is a minimum sample size for using partial profile? I know it's very dependent upon the number of attributes, levels, and total, as well as the ones you are going to show, and then also what you as a researcher want your standard errors to be. But I didn't know if you had any sort of rules of thumb or recommendation around partial profile sample sizes.
Yeah, so I mean, there's not really a good way to test, how increases in respondent reliability going from full profile to partial profile. I think the best thing you can do is what we recommend for a standard CBC. Make sure you run your design tests and look at those standard errors. Test out different numbers of questions and different numbers of respondents to see whether you can get your standard errors into the range that we would normally find acceptable for full profile CBCs.
Perfect. Thanks. All right, I think that's all the questions we have for today. As Aaron said, thank you for supporting us and joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Sawtooth Software webinar. Take care.
Great. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.